Black teen walks 10 miles to job interview. CEO sees him and does the unthinkable. The sun had barely risen over the quiet streets of Easton Heights when 17-year-old Malik Evans laced up his worn-out sneakers for what would become the most defining walk of his young life. The morning air still held a trace of last night's rain, and the sky glowed softly with a promise of heat to come. But Malik wasn't focused on the weather. His mind was locked on something bigger, an opportunity, a future. He double-checked the small slip of paper he kept in his pocket with the address of Harlan and Lowe Logistics, a corporate titan he had admired since middle school. They were holding open interviews for warehouse trainees, nothing fancy, but enough to get his foot in the door. Enough to start. And in Malik's world, the chance to start meant everything. There was just one problem. The city buses weren't running near his neighborhood that morning, and his mother's car had been dead for weeks. Rideshares were a luxury they couldn't afford, not even for something this important. Malik had stared at the map on his cracked phone screen, his eyes growing wider as he realized the company's headquarters were 10 miles away. 10 miles across the city, through neighborhoods he didn't know, past areas he'd only seen in the news, and with no guarantee he'd even make it on time. But none of that mattered. Not when his little sister needed new shoes for school. Not when his mom came home every night with aching feet from double shifts. Not when his future depended on whether or not someone in a suit thought he was worth taking a chance on. So he walked, with his tie tucked carefully in his backpack to avoid wrinkles, and his resume, printed at the public library, in a plastic folder to shield it from the wind. Malik set off just before 6 a.m. His breath clouding in the morning air. Every step he took wasn't just a step toward a building. It was a step away from every person who had told him he wouldn't make it. As he passed shuttered shops, empty bus stops, and sleepy storefronts, his mind wandered. He imagined what the interviewers would ask, what he'd say, whether they'd notice the gap in his work history, or the fact that his address was in the part of town people pretended didn't exist. By mile 3, his calves had started to burn. By mile 5, his shirt was clinging to his back, damp with effort. But by mile 7, he found something unexpected, a rhythm. The ache in his legs no longer felt like pain, felt like purpose. Around the corner of 18th and Melrose, Malik slowed down, noticing a woman in scrubs struggling to start her car. He hesitated, then offered help, managing to fix the loose battery connection. She thanked him with tears in her eyes, saying, "You just saved my day, young man." Malik smiled, nodded, and kept moving. By the time the corporate tower of Harlan and Lowe came into view, its silver glass gleaming under the sun like a monument to power and privilege, Malik felt a surge of something deeper than exhaustion. It was pride. It was resolve. As he approached the grand lobby doors, breathing hard but steady, he paused. He pulled out a wrinkled pack of tissues, wiped his face, and adjusted his shirt collar. He wasn't just going in there as a desperate teen looking for a job. He was going in as a young man who had walked 10 miles to earn the right to be seen. And just as he took a breath and stepped through the massive glass doors, a black luxury SUV pulled up behind him. Malik didn't notice it, but the man inside noticed him. And that man was the CEO. The lobby of Harlan and Lowe was nothing like anything Malik had ever stepped into. Tall marble columns stood like silent judges, polished floors reflected light like mirrors, and soft instrumental music drifted from invisible speakers, as if the whole space were trying to whisper something refined into the air. For a brief moment, Malik paused at the threshold, suddenly aware of his frayed laces and the small stain on his pant leg that he hadn't noticed earlier. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. A security guard at the desk looked up, professional but slightly surprised. Malik greeted him with a respectful "Good morning, sir," and explained he was there for the open warehouse interviews. The guard gave a curt nod, handed him a temporary visitor badge, and pointed him toward a waiting area where a small group of other applicants sat in neatly arranged chairs. Malik joined them quietly, clutching his folder with both hands, his knuckles white. A tall woman in a slate-gray pantsuit occasionally came out to call the next name. Each time she did, Malik sat up straighter, his nerves pushing against his ribcage like a second heartbeat. The room was sterile and quiet, save for the soft shuffle of resumes and the hum of fluorescent lights. But elsewhere, in a higher, glass-wrapped office above them, a very different kind of conversation was happening. Up on the 18th floor, Richard Harlan stood with a coffee cup in hand, gazing down at the plaza below. His tailored suit was immaculate, his salt and pepper hair sculpted into perfect professionalism, and his office looked more like a design studio than a workspace. Across from him sat Denise Farrell, his executive assistant of 15 years, who had arrived moments ago with a confused expression. "You saw him walking in?" she asked. Richard nodded slowly, his tone somewhere between disbelief and curiosity. "Yes, long before that. I was in the car, finishing a call, just about to get out when I noticed him. Looked like he'd been walking for hours. His shoes were soaked, clothes wrinkled, but his face, there was no panic, just intent." Denise raised an eyebrow. "And you followed him inside?" He chuckled. "I had security pull the footage to see which department he was heading toward. Warehouse interviews." He sipped his coffee. "And now I want to know who he is." Downstairs, Malik's name was finally called. He rose quickly, suddenly conscious of his aching legs, and followed the woman down a long corridor lined with framed company photos. She led him into a simple interview room, white walls, a single table, 2 chairs. Another woman, younger, maybe in her 30s, sat with a clipboard, smiling politely but not warmly. "Malik Evans?" she confirmed. "Yes, ma'am," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Thank you for seeing me." The woman nodded and gestured for him to sit. "Let's start with what made you want to apply here." Malik blinked. He'd practiced this question over and over. "I've been following Harlan and Lowe since I was 14, he began. "When I read that article about your green initiative and how you restructured your shipping models to reduce emissions, I thought, that's the kind of company I want to grow with. I know I'm just applying for an entry-level role, but I see a future here. I'm a quick learner, and I work harder than anyone I know." There was no arrogance in his tone, just truth and an unspoken exhaustion behind his eyes. The interviewer glanced over his resume, then at his shoes. "It says you're 17, still in school." "I graduated early," Malik replied. "I've been helping my mom with the bills, but now I'm trying to build something steady, something bigger." The woman nodded again, expression unreadable. "And how did you get here today, Malik?" He hesitated. "I walked." "From where?" He named his neighborhood. Her eyes widened slightly, doing the math. 10 miles. She said nothing, just scribbled something on her paper. Meanwhile, back on the 18th floor, Richard Harlan had already called a halt to his next meeting. "Get me the name of the young man who just walked into interview room C," he said to Denise. She blinked. "You're serious?" "I haven't been this serious in years." Back downstairs, the interview wrapped up. Malik shook hands, thanked them, and stepped out with relief flooding his body like cold water. He'd done his part. Now the rest was out of his hands. But what he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that before the end of that day, the CEO of one of the largest logistics companies in the country would personally ask to meet him. And nothing in Malik's life would ever be the same again. Malik had barely made it out the revolving glass doors when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He fumbled it free, still gripping his folder with one hand, and saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. For a second, he debated letting it go to voicemail. He was tired, sore, and already planning the long walk back home, but something told him to answer. "Hello?" he said, trying to steady his breath. "Mr. Evans?" A calm voice replied. "This is Denise Farrell, executive assistant to Richard Harlan. Mr. Harlan would like to speak with you, if you're available now." Malik froze in the middle of the sidewalk. For a moment, he wondered if this was some kind of joke. "Richard Harlan, the CEO? Yes. He saw you earlier and asked specifically to speak with you. Would you mind coming back inside?" He blinked at the tall glass building he'd just exited, now looming over him like a giant invitation. Sure. I'm still right outside." "Perfect. I'll meet you in the lobby in 2 minutes." Click. Malik stood motionless for several seconds before shaking off the disbelief. He turned back around, re-entered the building, and spotted the same security guard who now looked mildly impressed. "You're heading upstairs, huh?" the man said, half smiling. "I guess so," Malik replied with a sheepish grin. Moments later, Denise, dressed sharply in navy blue, greeted him with a professionalism that was friendly but reserved. She introduced herself quickly and led him to a private elevator that bypassed all other floors. The ride up was silent, save for the faint whir of machinery and Malik's heartbeat in his ears. The doors opened into a space that looked like something out of a magazine: sleek glass walls, wood paneling, bookshelves filled with thick hardcover volumes, and large abstract paintings that probably cost more than his mom's car. And there, by the window, stood Richard Harlan himself. He turned and smiled. "Malik, thank you for coming back." Malik stepped forward cautiously, unsure whether to offer a handshake or a salute. "Yes, sir," he said, eyes wide. I appreciate you wanting to meet me." Richard motioned for him to sit in one of the 2 chairs near a small coffee table, not behind a desk but across from him like equals. He sat down opposite and studied the young man quietly for a moment, as if looking for confirmation of something he'd suspected. "I saw you walking this morning," he said finally. "You didn't know anyone was watching, but you had purpose. You didn't stop. And then I watched the footage of your interview. You walked 10 miles for an entry-level job. That says more to me than a dozen polished resumes." Malik didn't know what to say, so he said the only honest thing he could. "I just needed a shot. That's what I'm offering." Malik blinked. Richard leaned forward slightly. "I don't think warehouse work is where you belong, Malik. I think your mind's too sharp for that. You talked about our shipping emissions and our logistics systems in your interview. Most applicants don't even know we have those programs. And you're 17. That tells me a lot." Malik swallowed, nerves flooding his chest. "Are you saying you want to hire me for something else?" "I'm saying I want to sponsor you," Richard said. "I've done this before, twice actually. Both of them now lead their own teams. I'll offer you a mentorship, part-time work while you take night classes, and in a few years, if you're still hungry and still walking towards something, you'll have a seat at any table in this company you want." Malik's voice caught in his throat. "Why me?" Richard smiled. "Because most people don't walk 10 miles for a job interview. But you did. And I believe that says something rare and important about who you are." For a moment, the boy from the neighborhood where the buses ran late and the lights flickered too often just sat there, stunned. Then, quietly, he said, "I won't waste this." Richard nodded. "I know." Downstairs, in the lobby, people kept coming and going, unaware of the conversation unfolding above them. And somewhere on the sidewalk outside, the path Malik had walked that morning was already fading in the heat. But a different kind of journey had just begun. one that didn't depend on the condition of his shoes or the distance between where he started and where he wanted to go. This one was about direction, and for the first time in his life, someone with power and a platform had decided to walk toward him. For the first week after that extraordinary elevator meeting, Malik felt as though the ground itself had changed texture beneath his feet. Still solid, still familiar, yet somehow more elastic, as if every step now held a spring that could launch him farther than he had ever dared imagine. Richard Harlan's offer wasn't just a job. It was a corridor lined with doors he'd never even known existed, and each one seemed to glow with possibility. The new routine began at dawn. Every weekday morning, a company shuttle, really just a repurposed delivery van repainted in Harlan and Lowe's emerald and silver colors, rolled into Easton Heights at 6 a.m. sharp to pick Malik up. The driver, Mr. Sutton, was an old Navy vet who greeted him with a two-finger salute and gospel music humming low on the radio. Malik still brought his resume folder, though he no longer needed it. It had become a kind of talisman, a reminder of the kid who once walked 10 miles with nothing but paper armor and a heart full of hope. Richard placed him in the analytics bullpen, a big glass-walled room overlooking the warehouse floor, where data from thousands of shipments scrolled across monitors like neon rivers. Malik's title was Junior Logistics Apprentice, but the work felt bigger. He was learning to read the digital pulse of a global company, to see patterns in late trucks, fuel spikes, and weather delays, and then suggest tweaks that shaved minutes and dollars off the supply chain. 2 evenings a week, he attended night classes at the community college, Intro to Statistics, Technical Writing, and an online coding module paid in full by Harlan and Lowe. The schedule was brutal, but Malik had known harder grinds that paid far less. Yet success, he learned, draws its own shadows. Whispered doubts. It started with hushed voices in the break room. Is he somebody's nephew? Probably a PR stunt. Rich guy rescues poor kid. I heard he just walked in off the street and the CEO hired him. Nobody's that lucky. Malik pretended not to hear, but the words clung like oil. One afternoon, he found an anonymous sticky note on his monitor. Earn your place. He stared at the phrase for a long time, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the same plastic folder that once carried his resume. Another reminder, but of a different sort. When he mentioned it to Richard during a weekly check-in in the executive lounge, the older man's face hardened. I can't control every whisper in this building, Richard said, voice low but steady. But I can give you something stronger than approval. Results. When numbers shift because of an idea you proposed, the whispers have to listen. Malik nodded, though a knot remained in his chest. I just don't want anyone thinking I'm here for charity. Richard leaned back, eyes thoughtful. Charity is a handout. Opportunity is a handshake. I offered my hand. You decided to walk the rest of the way. The first test. 3 weeks in, a late-season hurricane veered unexpectedly toward the Gulf, threatening to strand 2 container ships carrying urgent medical supplies. Malik, poring over live feed data, noticed a narrow weather window and an underused rail line 3 states inland that could reroute part of the cargo if trucks were staged in advance. He drafted a plan, annotated it with risk metrics learned only days earlier in class, and sent it hesitantly to his supervisor. By noon, the proposal sat on Richard's desk. By nightfall, a skeletal version was approved. By dawn, convoys were already rolling north of the storm. The move saved 48 hours and an estimated $600,000 in penalties. In the Monday leadership huddle, Richard cited a recommendation by our newest apprentice, Malik Evans. People clapped. Some faces looked surprised. Others suddenly respectful. That evening, Malik walked past the breakroom whiteboard and saw the sticky note phrase rewritten in bold marker, but altered, earned. Someone had quietly crossed out the original word earn and added the past tense ed. The knot in his chest loosened just a little. Back home, Not everything changed so quickly on Orchard Drive. His mother still worked late shifts at the care facility, still came home with swollen ankles, though she smiled more now, as if she could finally exhale. Malik used his first paycheck to buy his little sister the purple high tops she'd been eyeing online, and the look on her face felt better than any compliment from a boardroom. But with each new mile he traveled on this unforeseen road, Malik sensed an old voice tugging at him, one that asked whether the distance between where he'd come from and where he was going might grow so wide that he'd forget how to cross back. On a quiet Saturday he walked the familiar streets, nodding to neighbors, noticing cracked sidewalks and flickering street lamps he used to pass without thought. He realized success would mean little if the path he blazed couldn't shine some light backward. 2. An unexpected visitor. Late one Wednesday, long after most offices had gone dark, Richard tapped on the glass of the analytics bullpen. "Walk with me," he said. They rode the elevator in reflective silence to a private garage where a black SUV idled. Inside waited Ellen Lowe, co-founder and majority chair, rarely seen in day-to-day operations. Her sharp eyes assessed Malik kindly but directly. "I've heard a lot about you," she said as the driver pulled out into city traffic. "Richard tells me you see supply networks like subway maps. Fast, intuitive. We need that vision on a new community logistics hub we're funding on the south side." Malik was speechless. Richard filled the silence. "It's a pilot facility, freight, fresh food distribution, job training. It needs someone who understands both the data and the neighborhoods." Ellen's gaze softened. "Someone who still knows what it's like to walk 10 miles when the buses don't come." The SUV stopped outside a vast, vacant building surrounded by empty lots. Moonlight spilled over cracked asphalt. To most eyes it looked abandoned. To Malik it looked unfinished. Richard turned to him. "Tomorrow we meet with city planners. I want you there. No title politics, just brains and lived experience." Malik stepped out, cool night air filling his lungs. He stared at the hulking structure and felt, somewhere deep, the echo of every step he had taken that first morning. The ache, the purpose, the promise. The road was still long, but now it branched, leading not only upward but outward, toward a future large enough to carry others with him. He looked back at Richard and Ellen, standing by the open SUV door. "I'll be there," he said. And for the first time, he understood that the miles behind him were not just distance, they were legacy in the making. The day dawned with a slow, glowing quiet, the kind of hush that settles over a city before something big happens, before a ribbon gets cut, before lights come on, before applause rises. Malik stood outside the new Southside Logistics Innovation Hub, his reflection warped slightly in the polished glass of the building he had helped design, not as an architect but as a voice, a translator between data and humanity. A crowd had already begun to gather. City officials in tailored suits, local small business owners clutching flyers and dreams, curious teens with camera phones, and elders in folding chairs whispering about how they'd never thought they'd live to see this corner of town turn into anything but a delivery shortcut. Standing beside him was Richard Harlan, beaming with quiet pride, and Ellen Lowe, calm and poised but with the unmistakable energy of someone who knew this was history in motion. "This is your stage too," Ellen said gently. Malik blinked, adjusting the knot in his tie. "I've never given a speech before." Richard patted his shoulder. "Just tell them how you got here." A speech that started with silence. When Malik stepped up to the microphone, there was a second of silence. Not the kind that waits to judge, but the kind that leans in. He could feel the weight of eyes on him. Eyes that looked like his. Eyes that came from places with cracked sidewalks, broken vending machines, and untold ambition. "I walked here," he began. "Not just today. I walked here through a lot of mornings no one saw, through neighborhoods that maps ignore, through doubt, through people telling me what I wasn't. But I also walked here with a question. What happens when someone believes in you before the world decides it should? He looked out over the crowd. Today we open this building. But more importantly, we open a path. One where you don't need perfect shoes or the right zip code or a golden last name. You just need the guts to take that first step. Applause thundered. Not polite, not rehearsed, but eruptive and human. Cameras flashed. And in that moment, Malik Evans became more than a story. He became a signal. A full circle. Later that night, after the last folding chair was stacked, Malik walked the perimeter of the center alone. A young boy on a bike slowed next to him. You the guy who built this? Malik smiled. Part of it. A lot of people helped. The boy looked around, eyes wide. Can kids come here? Absolutely, Malik said. This is for you. The kid nodded and rode off, a trail of dust behind him. Malik watched until the bike became a blur under a streetlight, and then he turned toward the sidewalk, toward the long, winding path back home. He didn't need a shuttle tonight. He wanted to walk it, every mile.